much for this very wise conclusion, which we will remember, and I might remind to some people.
Yeah.
We're going now to listen to Mr. Salimaki, who is Director General of the Finnish Transport and Communication Agency. Do you need help with that?
Let's see. I hope I'm able to manage.
I was able to manage before. Perfect.
Okay. Nice to have this opportunity to meet you. Thank you for the invitation. This excellent event and this extremely beautiful venue. I'm going to approach this topic from the point of view of practical challenge that we are currently struggling in Finland. Some of you might already guess that since there's an anchor in the bottom of the sea and the topic is critical telecommunications infrastructure, I'm going to talk about the critical submarine infrastructure and the challenges that we are facing with it in Finland. Just to give you a few words about the we are Transport and Communications Agency of Finland, and we are responsible for national cybersecurity, transport, all transport modes, aviation, maritime, railroad, and road traffic, and also communication services and infrastructure. So we have quite broad responsibility over our critical infrastructure. One of our key tasks, according to our strategy, is to ensure the smooth, sustainable, safe and secure movement of people, goods, information and data. And this is probably the key topic I'm going to cover today. As you can see from this map, next to Finland is Russia, and from west to us is Europe. And from Europe point of view, Finland is pretty much an island. And we are, of course, completely dependent on our submarine cables, both energy and telecommunications side. Telecommunication cables are the fastest and most reliable route to Europe. And of course, since the Russia's war in Ukraine, we have been in a situation in which the border to Russia has been closed, which means that we are not able to rely neither transport or communications that go through them. So we are quite dependent on the communication networks that are available to West. Last year, there has been quite a lot of critical incidents in the Baltic Sea regarding submarine infrastructure. At the end of 23, there was two cable cuts between Finland and Estonia, and also Baltic connector, which was a gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia, was broken. The root cause was a ship that dragged anchor at the seabed. The same situation happened again in the end of last year, in November 24, when two connections between Finland and Germany got broken, and also connection from Sweden to Lithuania got broken. And the latest incident that was directly affecting Finland happened at last year's Christmas, when four cables between Finland and Estonia got broken. And in all of these cases, the root cause was the ship cracking the anchor at the seabed. And of course, to us, these are extremely challenging cases, and personally to me, they are extremely frustrating, because even though our critical infrastructure or telecommunication connections are quite redundant, still it's quite a hassle to manage these situations. As for example, the last incident happened on the 25th of December, Christmas Day, and it pretty much brought all the security organizations to full working mode, and it is of course not that nice to spend your Christmas like that. Just to go briefly through the legislation we have in place to highlight the key or to share the understanding how this challenge is approached. Of course, the communication networks are built in a way that they must withstand normal, expected climatic, mechanical, and other external disturbances. But if the situation is that you are tracking an anchor over the seabed which might weigh 40-50 tons, there is nothing you can do to protect the infrastructure at the seabed. You can try to dig it as deep as you want. You can put concrete over it. Something will happen if this is done many times enough. Well, telcos do their best to build the network, but of course they'll have to be able to also identify the disturbances. If something happens, they'll have to be able to identify that something is disturbed or there is a fault in the networks. And I think that one of the challenges that we are seeing at this moment, at least in the EU, is the fact that when the telcos identify these kinds of incidents, they only have to report it if they have big enough impact on the service. And if these, for example, a couple of these incidents I mentioned before, there could have been more done if the information about the original cable cut would reach all the parties faster, so that we could maybe try to interfere the ship causing the problem, causing the faults or anything like that, or use any other methods to try to prevent the additional damages that might be caused by the ships. In one instance, there was 12 hours gap, and when we reached out to one of our neighbors, the regulator did not have information about that incident at that point, because the incident wasn't big enough, so that it was mandatory for the telco to report it to the regulator, and since the regulator didn't know, they couldn't know, of course, warn us. And this is maybe something that we should focus on in the future. Just to give you a short understanding how we are protecting our infrastructure in this field. None of the incidents mentioned before had any impact on the communication services of Finland. We have, of course, several international cables that can be used. There are detailed and tested methods for rerouting the traffic, including inter-operator cooperation, so that if one operator is completely down, their traffic can be rerouted through other operators. Most important systems are duplicated, and most important communication connections are route secured. And as addition, the internet is, of course, built in a way that the traffic usually finds the way to reach the target. But of course, since we are extremely digitalized society, we'll have to be able to provide fast and secure networks to Finnish companies and Finnish organizations, and also for citizens. To conclude, we have to understand that there is no such thing as 100% of security or operational reliability. Something will happen and we have to be ready to react to it. Also, both cable breakages will happen in the future. I just hope that they don't will happen after Christmas Day, but they will happen and we can rely on that. The most important thing is to do our best to prevent them. If something happens, detect them and fix them as fast as possible. And of course, share common understanding and share information on a level that we can react in the best possible way as fast as possible, because we can quite often, like in the Christmas Days incident, prevent much bigger damages if we are active. Thank you.
The last speaker of our panel is Mr. Vilnius, who is planning and oversight project manager at EPSO-G, which is a state-owned energy company. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm sort of an infiltrator in this one, I guess, together with my panel colleague from Sanofi, since I come from the business side of things and rather not from a regulatory institution. But I have personally before worked in the past at the Lithuanian National Energy Regulatory Authority briefly, so I'm not completely out of touch with you all. My presentation will be about the main risks that the energy sector faces and how we could solve them potentially with some more effective regulation. I try to do this presentation to be more relevant not only for what's happening for Lithuanian energy companies, but also for companies working in Europe, at least on a European scale. So first, a brief introduction of the company I'm coming from, EPSO-G. So EPSO-G is a state-owned energy company. 100% of our shares are held by the state of Lithuania, and our shareholder, the state's shareholder rights are exercised through the Ministry of Energy of Lithuania. Our main activities concentrate on the operation and maintenance of the electricity and gas transmission systems done by our subsidiary companies Lithuania and Nordic. Some other activities that our companies do are such things as operating one of the few European biomass exchanges done by our company VMVT, operating currently the largest in Europe battery energy storage system done by our company Energy Cells. We also have an electricity network construction and maintenance company, TEPAS, and our new subsidiary, EPSO-G Invest. It's a project management and investment company that's focusing on non-energy related projects. So we have quite a broad portfolio of activities that we do, and this gives us a kind of a broader view and more holistic view of the energy system, seeing all the issues that are present in it. Now, going into the risks, so I have identified three key risks that I think are the most important. Starting from the first one, it can be very clearly seen from the war in Ukraine, of course, and that's associated with the security of energy infrastructure. In this picture that you see on the screen here, you can see the destruction of the Novakhovka Dam in Ukraine, which is probably the largest singular event of damage to Ukrainian energy infrastructure done so far in the war, as Russia has relentlessly over the past 3 years attacked Ukrainian energy infrastructure. It's sort of difficult at this moment to calculate how much damage was exactly done to Ukrainian energy infrastructure, but the latest data that I found for data up to the May of 2024, at least $16 billion of damage has been done to Ukrainian energy infrastructure, most of it to electricity generation and transmission, but also other sectors such as gas, oil, centralized heating. It's also kind of difficult to calculate how much it would take to rebuild this infrastructure, but calculations currently show that it would cost at least $50 billion to rebuild everything that was destroyed in Ukraine. But of course, you don't need to be at war in order for your infrastructure to be damaged, for your assets to be damaged. As my colleague from Finland mentioned in his presentation, in the Baltic Sea. Over the past 1.5 years, there have been several incidents with undersea infrastructure, particularly in the natural gas transportation sector, also fiber optic cables and electricity cables. In these pictures on the screen right here, they're from Finnish authorities, and they show an incident from 2023 October, when a tanker drew its anchor through gas pipeline Baltic connector between Estonia and Finland, cut it off, and this is the damage that has been done to that pipeline, as well as the anchor that has been stranded from the bottom of the sea. So these incidents are very likely a sort of hybrid warfare, most probably done by Russia. But even if these are not acts of sabotage, but just simple accidents, the fact remains that infrastructure was damaged, and that's what's most important for energy companies, is we need to react to the fact that infrastructure is being damaged. And many companies in Europe are already doing that, reacting to that, learning from the war in Ukraine, and trying to improve the safety of the infrastructure that we are operating, building additional physical barriers, improving their cybersecurity, buying anti-drone systems even. And what this means from a regulatory standpoint going forward is that more expenses will be need to set out to improve security of infrastructure, critical infrastructure in Europe, and that will probably mean also approving investments with a higher premium set out for security measures when approving the investments into infrastructure. Going to the second risk, so the world as a whole, and especially the European Union, has set out quite ambitious goals in order to fight climate change in the coming decades, and this requires for us to go away from fossil fuel-based energy to renewable resource-based energy. This is, of course, very expensive, and I've taken my company FCG as an example. So at the end of last year, we updated our strategy up to 2035. And in this strategy, we have planned out our investments up to 2035. We see that we will need to invest between 7 and 9 billion euros into expanding our energy network, into expanding into new things such as a hydrogen network and many other things that are important for the future. And that is quite a lot of money. Lithuania also has very ambitious goals going forward, as you can see in this graph, in making more renewable energy generated locally here. So we want to especially generate a lot more energy from solar and wind in the future. And our company in 2023 did a study on the Lithuanian energy transformation, and we calculated how much it would cost for Lithuania to transform its energy sector to reach net zero by 2050. And the sum is at least 70 billion euros. So to put that into perspective, 70 billion euros is almost the GDP of Lithuania in 2024, the whole GDP of Lithuania. And our country is rather small, of course, but if you take as an example countries such as France or Germany, imagine how big the costs are in these countries. Or if you take the whole European Union, 500 million people living here. So how big the costs are for the whole of the European Union. And there are already issues for some companies that need to do this energy transformation. For example, recently the largest European steel producer has announced that they are delaying their projects investments into hydrogen. The Belgian electricity transmission system operator has signaled that it will probably delay their investments into an energy hub to connect offshore wind off the coast of Belgium. And this shows that business is not very comfortable and doesn't see a business case for the energy transformation that we've set out, which means that going forward from a regulatory standpoint, we need to make sure that it's easier to make business for the energy sector, but also it's very important to offer new incentives to do these investments in order for us to achieve net zero and other goals set out. And the third risk is associated with regulatory cautiousness, and I mean it in a sort of twofold way. So from one perspective, you can see to regulatory agencies, and oftentimes regulatory agencies are sort of very cautious in approving new investments into especially new energy resources. But on the other hand, we have also policymakers, which make the policies that the regulatory institutions later abide by. So they are usually quite late in figuring out what policies we need to have, especially for new energy resources. And if we look at the energy system as a whole, the energy system of, let's say, 20 years ago was a lot different than the one that we have currently right now and the one we're developing into. Like the old energy system was not so complicated. It was easy to say which market participants are consumers, which are producers. Most of the electricity was generated by big mechanical power plants. There were very few renewable energy sources. And we're moving into a system that is a lot more complicated now. So we have renewable energy sources which are pretty hard to predict how much energy and when exactly will they generate. We have the ability to use that excess energy from renewable sources to create things such as hydrogen. We have the ability to utilize carbon capture technologies, then afterwards using the captured carbon and hydrogen to make synthetic fuels. It's also not so very clear what roles each company is now playing in the energy sector, or each market participants, what are they doing? Because we have now consumers that are also producers, such as people that have rooftop solar plants at their house, they also produce energy. And looking into these many changes that have been happening over the past few years, I think it's a good thing to raise a question whether we should have a more fundamental review of the regulatory framework that the energy sector is working on, instead of doing just incremental changes. Because the system that we set our regulatory framework 20 years ago was very different from the one we're operating into now. And we need to adapt to these changes. In many companies, it is quite difficult at times nowadays to understand whether they can do these activities or whether they cannot. So there's a lot of unclarity for them how constrained are their activities. And this is very important to solve if we want to reach our goals of achieving also net zero by 2050. So to sum up, the three key risks that I find most important in the energy sector are infrastructure security, financing risks, and of course regulatory clarity. I think these are the three main things that we should be solving going forward into the future, also from a regulatory perspective. If we want to achieve the goal of becoming climate neutral by 2050, and if we want to achieve the goal of the European Union becoming more self-sufficient in energy resources and less reliant on imports from third countries. Thank you.
Thanks a lot to the speakers for very interesting and rich of examples and conclusions and findings presentations. So thanks a lot. We also have with us Mr. Bo, who works at the Belgian Federal Authority in charge of energy security as energy security officer. And I wanted to start with you with the questions and maybe ask you a question, which is basically, how do you manage risks that are in the category of uncertain and unknown? It works around. It's already said.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. Also, thank you for holding this presentation. I am totally aligned with what these two last speakers do. So, managing the unknown, it's part, I would say, to the concept of resilience. In Europe, we're switching from critical infrastructure protection to the global concept of resilience. And in this global concept of resilience, you have the prevention, the monitoring, so you try to see the danger coming, try to do the risk analysis to identify the danger, but sometimes is not well known. You try to monitor it, could be with sensors and so on. And then when you face the danger, sometimes the danger applies to your company, and then you try to mitigate it, like containment tactics. It could be in cybersecurity containment tactics, like a highland mode or something like that. And then in this concept of resilience, there's also this concept of trying to still provide essential service for the society. And then we have the repairing capacity. So when you face a risk unknown in this framework, globally a company can be resilient enough to face this kind of hazard. And then you have also communication plan in order to communicate with all the authorities, with other companies, with the regulators, defense. So I think that the framework that the European Union and also NATO is building is like to face these hazards.
Thanks a lot. I think this panel is also very rich because we have different profiles and also people coming from not only regulators, but also the private sector. I have a question for whoever is interested in replying. So this session was about what are the challenges in regulating effectively major public risks, right? And my question is, somebody talked about opportunities before? Are there challenges that can become an opportunity? Graham?
Nobody's very keen on your question. I think at one level, all challenges have an opportunity, because that is the definition of a challenge. It's an opportunity surrounded by risk. But the particular challenges that we have just heard about are very difficult because they are challenges that are not owned by any one party. So as a part of the government, I can talk about challenges and opportunities, but then how does that sound to the business community? How does that sound to the third sector? How does that sound to international partners? And so when we talk about turning a challenge into an opportunity, we have to make sure that we take our stakeholders with us. It's not enough just to make it a great opportunity for me and government, but also we have to make it an opportunity for others. And I think one of the, I don't want to appear to be over-pessimistic, but I think one of the problems with these challenges is they are, some people use this phrase, wicked issues. Wicked issues are those that are complex and intangible at the same time. So it's not only like a ball of string, where's the end, but also it's actually we can't even decide if it's a ball of string. And so because we don't really find it easy to define the challenge, I think we find it harder to identify the opportunity. That doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity there, but it does mean we have to work collaboratively and collectively. And I hope what I heard from all of the presentations, was there isn't one person who owns these challenges. This is not about the regulators doing a better job or the business community doing a better job, it's about working together. So yes, I do think there are opportunities. The one I would talk to is the opportunity of AI and digital tools that will enable us to manipulate data, which I mentioned very briefly at the end of what I said. I think we are on the cusp of having access to much, much better tools that will help us all. But we see at the moment real ethical questions about how that data is made available, who uses it, who owns it, who controls it. I think if we can solve those problems, then I think there are some good opportunities.
No, this works, yeah. So a very specific example for challenges that I think overall challenges are the ones that drive, let's say, change. But a very specific example is from 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. Before that, we had a gas crisis, an energy resource crisis. So the cost of natural gas, especially electricity and other resources, rose very significantly, for Europe especially. It was very difficult to find where we can get these resources from. So there was an opportunity coming from this, invest more into renewable resources and everything like that. I think if there wouldn't have been this challenge presented to European countries,
it's very unlikely that there would have been so many significant investments done into renewable energy. I don't think we would have seen the growth that we've seen over the past years in this sector, and we probably would have still even more stagnated than we had before. Right now, I think Europe as a region is facing another challenge, is that it's seen by international business as not very competitive when compared to, let's say, the United States, or maybe even China, Asia, other regions. So this is the current challenge that industry as a whole, not only the energy sector, but all the industry needs to tackle in Europe. And we'll see how we will react to this challenge. It's possible that we will fail and then we'll just roll down to the bottom of importance on the global scale. But it's possible that new ways will be found how to improve on the situation, and that we will grow and see that industry.
Suddenly everyone was uniquely motivated by the purpose, completely aligned, working together very efficiently, reaching out to each other, reaching out to the outside world, to the partners, to the authorities. It's been incredible. She says, the only thing I want is that we are always working together. Now how can we? And I think an element of this, because here I agree we should not wait for crisis, is probably to organize games, simulation, storytelling, where we have to sit together to reflect on what it would mean for all of us. And this would help us build and assemble.
Done away with it and that. But there is no such thing as zero risk, which the previous speaker mentioned. The objectives is actually trying to achieve something. So you've got an opportunity to achieve something. In doing so, there are risks, and you need to balance the risks with the opportunities, and that's what risk management is. And I think there's a danger that we as regulators sometimes lose sight of that. This is a new slide that I put in that I hadn't done before. Quite a lot of the conversation was that we've had over today, and a workshop I was at yesterday was, it's all well and good talking about risk-based regulation, but the cat in the tree, the fatality to the cyclist colours things. We're fortunate in Great Britain that we had a transformational approach to our regulation of health and safety 50 years ago. We had a new act which was completely different from everything that went before, and it basically said you need to concentrate on risk, you need to concentrate on outcomes, and producing more and more and more regulations, and even if you could, having more and more inspectors carrying out inspections is not the way to go. Because at the end of the day, the risks that are created are by the enterprises, the employers, and surely the primary responsibility for managing those risks should lie with them. And so the title of this plenary session is, how do we manage public risks? It's a general question, but within that question I just want to say that is not the job of regulators. It is the job of the people that create the risks to manage them. It's the job of regulators to make sure that they manage them. And it is a different activity. And it can influence the way in which you go. I was very interested in the presentation from Regis de Montadilla, if I pronounced your name right, this morning. It was a very impressive presentation. As somebody from industry, you're not going to come here and tell us all your problems. You're going to show put your finest clothes on, which is understandable entirely. But I was impressed by it, and this is a rhetorical question, but they are managing risk all of the time. One of their risks is the risks of not being in compliance with the regulations, but that's almost a different risk from managing the risks of the business. So I think we sometimes, as regulators, don't have conversations enough about risk management with the people that we're regulating, because surely the most effective way of us being successful is to get them to incorporate into their risk management things the things that we want them to manage. And if they do it as part of the way in which they go about their business, as opposed to this is what we do to go about our business, and also we've got to comply with the law, that strikes me as being suboptimal. So I think we should, as regulators, be aspiring to do that all of the time. This particular slide is because of the conversations that people had about it's getting people, politicians, members of the public to understand this. We had that conversation in the UK 30 years ago. There was a public inquiry into building a new nuclear power station. And the term that was used, and was used by IRA, was acceptability of risk. And at the public inquiry, the judge overseeing it said, we need to change the dynamics of this because it's not acceptability, it's tolerability. And you, HSE, as the regulator, haven't properly communicated your approach to the management of risk. So we produced what was quite a seminal document called the tolerability of risk. And I'm glad I took the numbers off this because otherwise we might have had a discussion about numbers. But basically, it is a philosophy about trying to get a proportional sense to risk management. And if you've not come across it before, you know, I've given you the slide in order for you to do it. This was focused on nuclear power stations, but it's got much broader and much more general implications. And it was subsequently followed up by another document called Reducing Risks, Protecting People. I think this was around, it came out about the same time as Star Wars, so it was shortened to R2P2. And it was a way of HSE explaining its decision-making process. So if you're on a journey about risk management and you're talking about, but how do we communicate and engage with politicians and society about it, spend a couple of hours looking at this and find if there's anything useful to you in relation to that. The third part of what I wanted to say was the more specific topic that I was asked to speak upon, which is understanding how risk materialises. And I was a bit apprehensive about how do I go about talking about that with loads of regulators, with loads of different responsibilities and that. And I thought by now someone would already have mentioned this, but can I just, as a show of hands, can you just people put up their hands if they're familiar with the concept of the Swiss cheese model of defence? Okay, good. That means that the next 5 minutes isn't going to be wasted on my part, but I just wanted to test that. Basically, this is a bit of work carried out by another mathematician, they all seem to be mathematicians, called James Reason. And it was mainly originally directed at sort of high risk, high hazard type things, but I think the model in answering the exam question for this speech it's very relevant. Basically, the premise is that if you've got a risk that you're responsible for managing, so you've got a hazard at one end, the risk is that hazard turning itself into an incident, you put in place mechanisms to prevent that from happening, and they're barriers. James Reason calls them defences. I would prefer to call them, I'm not disagreeing with him, but to me they are preventative mechanisms. So those barriers represent the design of equipment, the training and competence of the workplace. You might design equipment well, but then you need to maintain it. It's your written rules and procedures for how things should be done in the business. One of those barriers, in theory, is actually the regulatory system, which is a whole different story. And one of the barriers is actually, in terms of any organisation, is the culture, the moral compass of the organisation, the culture of the organisation. And basically, James Reason's premise is that you have these barriers to prevent harm from happening, and basically the harm can't get through the barrier. But the reality is all these barriers deteriorate over time, And so you have holes in them, thus the Swiss cheese analogy. And what happens is that you then find that the safeguards that you put in place, the protective measures, aren't always what you thought they were or don't work efficiently. And when you get a hazard that starts to manifest itself, if in its development it goes, all the holes in the cheese are aligned, that's when you end up with an incident. The reality is that quite often the holes don't align and it's actually stopped at a barrier. That's what's called a near miss. Do people pay any attention to the near misses? Not enough, because it should tell them we didn't have an incident, but we had 3 of our barriers breached. The next time the hole in the final barrier might not align and we'll have an incident. So we need to be fixing the holes in the others. So it's a continuous challenge in terms of doing it. So just to give you some, real examples, we did some work in the North Sea, and a company had this system for testing whether their mechanical systems were working okay. And one guy had to test the speed of response of an emergency shut-off valve, and he activated it. It didn't operate as quickly as it should have done, so he's got a tin of WD-40. Does everybody know what WD-40 is? A sort of aerosol lubricant. Sprayed the WD-40 on the safety relief valve, waited a little while, tested it again, and it worked. And so he gave a green tick because it showed it was working okay. And why did he give that green tick? Because despite what the company said about its values and that, at the end of the day, he knew that people on the beach wanted all greens. The culture was wrong. The organisation should have welcomed him for the test demonstrating that it didn't work the way in which it should work, because the next time it might not be a mechanic testing it, the next time it might be a real incident when you need the thing to close. And you can't stop a real incident and go along with a jar of WD-40. So another example might be machinery guarding. You have a dangerous operation and you've got guarding around it and that, and it's designed properly and it's got precautions as to how you use it and all that. But nobody had thought about how you actually maintain it overnight, when the maintenance engineer has to come in and override the interlocks and do that. So they think they've got a perfectly guarded machine, but they're not thinking about all of the risks. Swiss cheese model now is used in process safety for the chemical industry. It was used an awful lot in COVID, and it's valid for all, in my view, regulatory systems. And one of the things that we should be asking ourselves in our development of legislation and regulation is, are we actually identifying the right barriers? And how are we assuring ourselves that those barriers are working? So, when we, in HSE, when we go to high hazard plants, it's an interesting question to ask people whether they actually understand what their barriers are, and then to ask them, how do you know that there aren't holes in those barriers? Because the problem is, if you don't know whether there are holes in the barriers, and that's why you need to develop leading indicators to do so, all of the holes will align. That's how risk manifests itself. That's the mindset, I think, that regulators ought to apply. There's just one final thing I wanted to say, I won't keep too long. It's easier for us in the UK to talk about risk-based legislation, because that law that was introduced 50 years ago said it shall be the duty of every employer to with developments in new technology and research investigation into incidents where things go wrong. So I'd just like to conclude on that statement. So thank you very much.
Our last speaker for today is Donald, who's going to speak to us about how authorities can deal with public risk, citing the UK example. Donald was a career lawyer in the UK government from 1975 to 2007. He rose to become the Director General at the Ministry for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. He has since worked with 9 different ministries in his career. In 2007, he decided to be a consultant and has since advised over 40 governments in 6 continents, mainly including with the World Bank and OECD. He is widely recognized as a leader and a practitioner, a leading thinker and a practitioner in regulatory delivery. Please join me in welcoming Donald. Thank you.
Apologies for this. It was my inefficiency in providing the right. Oh, there we go. That was faster than I expected, because I was hoping I was going to have a little time to comment on some of the previous presentations. Kevin was talking about enterprise risk going badly wrong, and that reminded me, in my first career in government, on the board of EFRA, that's the Ministry for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, I was the Senior Information Risk Owner and responsible for the balanced scorecard. And we took this very seriously, and I noticed that we were getting some very odd results from it. And I talked to one team that had been doing very well. They met all their targets, they were on time, they were on budget, and I said, so obviously your project is at green. And they said, no, we're at red. You can't be at red, everything is going well. Yes, but we must be at red, because red is safe. Green is dangerous. If it's red, then we'll get lots of money from the board, we'll get lots of attention, and we'll keep going forever. If it's green, they'll say, job done, we'll shut us down. So, that's enterprise risk in the public sector, not the private sector. My talk. How can authorities deal with public risk? This is going to be a bit of a history lesson, but Florence asked me to do a talk on the Risk and Regulation Advisory Council and the Dutch Risk and Responsibility Programme. And it is actually a lot more appropriate than I thought because of Ira's talk. He was talking about some of the ridiculous things that politicians can do with risk. And what I'm talking about here is a thread in regulatory reform that not a lot of people know about because it never really got off the ground. But I'm going to cover it anyway. So, I'm starting with the UK's Better Regulation Commission. The UK was one of the pioneers of better regulation under Tony Blair. And the Better Regulation Commission, well-respected body, came up with a good collection of terrible regulation. And the terrible regulation tended to follow some sort of disaster. So it's known as tombstone regulation, because the regulation was there as a tribute to all the people who died in that incident. And it was clearly a really bad thing. So, yeah, I had some examples of, well, you're one about the bridge. One person dies on the bridge, so you have to completely change all the bridges in the Netherlands. Well, this first report covered quite a few of these things. When Tony Blair left as Prime Minister and was succeeded by Gordon Brown, he didn't like external challenge, so he wanted to close down the Better Regulation Commission. I just joined it by then. But he allowed us to try to implement the risk report by setting up the Risk and Regulation Advisory Council. So our job was to analyse public risk. And we had just over a year to do it before it got closed down. And we took a systems-based approach to this. We defined public risk as those risks that may affect any part of society and to which government is expected to respond. That's pretty broad remit. But essentially what it was about was public anxiety. So really the issue here is how do you manage public anxiety in a democracy without resulting in bad regulation? Should public anxiety drive the regulation that you have? So we looked at public risk, we did a lot of case studies, we came up with a systems map, the risk landscape, where you have a decision maker, that's ministers, the yellow thing there. But we pointed out that it's far more complex, that there are an awful lot of actors involved in all this. So I think we did some good stuff, but the best thing that we did was to inspire the Dutch to do better. So we published our report, we published a lot of stuff, and at the end I'll give you a link to it. But nobody cared. It didn't really get much traction, and we didn't have any political support in the UK, but we inspired the Dutch, and that's no easy matter. And Jan van Tol set up the Dutch Risk and Responsibility Programme. And this ran for 5 years. And again, it was looking at the same thing, looking at how do you manage political response to disasters without ending up with bad regulation. And Margot Trachtenberg came up with this idea, the risk regulation reflex. It sounds even better in Dutch because there's so many R's. Yeah.
Risicoregelreflex.
Exactly, yes. And it's the political response to something bad happening. And that was defined as the pitfall of disproportionate government safety interventions following an incident or publication of a risk. So, like the RRAC, the RRR did a lot of research. It was not just at national level, also at local level. And I had the honour of being the international advisor on that programme, so I was involved in that one for another 5 years. Again, we published a toolkit, a lot of learning, and again, nobody really paid all that much attention. It should have been useful when we were then looking at the energy transition. And there, again, it was Jan van Tol who was trying to see if we could get a way of trying to manage the issues of how to make decisions for the energy transition. I'm not going to go into all this, but some points to take from it. The idea of Dutch risk policy principles. The Dutch are a very special nation when it comes to risk. I've never come across any other country where risk is taken so seriously, and it is something which Dutch citizens feel is a natural thing to talk about. It may have something to do with the fact that their country lies below sea level and may be wiped out at any point, but they tend to be slightly more risk averse than anybody else. The bit that Kevin wasn't going to raise with a Dutchman in the room was the level of unacceptability of risk. In the Netherlands, it's 10 to the -6, and for most of the rest of the world, it's 10 to the power of 7 in terms of what would constitute an acceptable risk. Where does all this leave us? Right. there has been this attention paid to how do we manage politicians and avoid them coming up with that regulation. We've got a lot of learning. There's a lot of good stuff that came out of these programs, but the difficulty is we're working against very, very powerful motivations. Politicians never want to waste a good crisis. If you have some dramatic event, then politicians will naturally try and use that because it's a photo opportunity, it's an opportunity for publicity. So they will always try and do something with it. If there's one bit of advice I can remember from my years on this, it was always try to avoid the minister going to the scene of the incident. Because if they do that, it's the classic photo opportunity and they're going to promise everything. Well, he is going to promise everything, because another thing we learned was the problem is the male ministers, not the female ministers. A male minister, his response to a crisis is, this must never happen again, and I will see to it that it never happens again. I will save you. I will come up with regulations to ensure this never happens. If you've got a female minister, she says, I feel your pain. Now let's move on. Now, this is a generalization, and it's maybe a bit sexist, but I'm inspired by what's happening across the pond in terms of forgetting about discrimination and all these sort of things, although it hasn't come to Europe yet. But generally, it is something that we do find, that it's the emotional response of the politicians that cause the problem. Now, what I did get out of it was one tool, which I do want to spend a bit of time talking about, called a concern assessment. And this is something that comes from the IRGC risk governance framework. And there's a bit down under risk appraisal over there on the right, where you've got risk assessment, and at the same time, you've got concern assessment. So concern assessment means you do an assessment of the public anxiety. If there is public anxiety, then that is going to be one of the drivers of what happens. So you need to assess that in its own right. And you need to run that in parallel to a more scientific risk assessment of whatever the actual problem was. And this, I think, is valuable learning, because the issue that you're dealing with may exist only at the level of public concern. When we're working on the hydrogen transition, the real problem there is not the dangers of hydrogen, it's the perception of the dangers of hydrogen. It's the perception that the Hindenburg is going to go up in flames again. But in fact, hydrogen is a lot safer than petrol. So the reality is much more positive in favor of hydrogen. And so this is an issue that may exist only at the level of public anxiety. Or it may be that the issue exists also at the level of public anxiety. There is a problem, but there is an additional problem, which is the public reaction to it. So it may also be that it's a weak signal of a deeper issue. The public feels uneasy about something. Now, there's no point in scientists saying, you're just being stupid. This doesn't matter. If the public feels badly about something, it may be that they just had some instinct that something is wrong. So it may be a weak signal of a deeper issue. So how do you resolve the concern? The public anxiety is not irrational, it's non-rational. And in these bodies that I work with, we try to avoid patronizing the public. We try to avoid thinking, well, it's just a matter of educating them. They're being silly. They're being irrational. Whereas what we were mixing up there was rationality and values. Values are not the same thing as rationality. And the public have values. And that is where the anxiety comes from. And the concern assessment needs to be looking at it in terms of values and understanding how to respond to the value issue, rather than looking at it scientifically and trying to find a rational answer. So how all this ends up is with politicians making a decision. And the answer to it should come from the science in terms of don't do the wrong thing, but it also has to come from values. Because if there is public anxiety in a democracy, that is something that needs to be dealt with. So the appropriate response to the public's concern is a political statement based on values or emotions which gives leadership. And the classic example we have from the London bombings in 2005, when bombs were going off in different places in London, people were terrified. We didn't know whether it was safer to stay inside a building or go out. There were rumours going around that all the train stations were closed, and there was general terror across the place. Tony Blair said simply, London remains open. And everybody relaxed. It changed everything. And that is a superb example of how politicians should respond to a crisis. Recognizing the concern, but dealing with it as a matter of values and feelings and emotions, not as a matter of rationality. So insofar as there is a rational problem, a scientific problem, you try to deal with that. But you also need to deal with public anxiety, because that's what democracy is about. Thank you.
Thank you. We're supposed to have Genius from the Lithuanian Transport Safety Administration, who's supposed to be part of the panel, but he has not been able to make it this afternoon. He expresses his regret and wishes all of us a successful and enjoyable event. We have some time for questions. Maybe I get the first one out of the way and we can get some questions from the audience. Are we kind of caught up in this cycle where we are not able to break through? Because on one instance, from the course of the day, we've been hearing a lot about risk and the need for risk management. At the same time, we've talked about the need for proportionate response. But yet, at the same time, as someone who's been in this role for many years now, and I kind of empathize with what you said earlier, a lot of the response is also emotive. It's the need to feel decisive, to be in control, to be seen as you are managing a risk. And it's very difficult, I think, at that point to say, let's be proportionate in our response. To even communicate that some risk is tolerable. And it was something that we talked about in the morning. Does require a lot of courage. And I suppose it comes with a lot of wisdom and experience for all of us in this room to be able to look back and say, if I were to do this differently, I would do this. But for someone who's perhaps young and starting out in the role, we haven't spent a lot of time talking about what might be qualities we would look out for. What might be capacity building that we could institutionalize or introduce, or even mechanisms that would promote or facilitate discussions, candid discussions about near misses. So I just wonder what your views and thoughts are about how perhaps we could create a system of culture in the future where there's almost a braking mechanism where we don't need to rush and safely go all the time. But there's a lot of circumspection and introspection. Is that even doable or desirable? Or are we really caught in this cycle where it comes as an afterthought where we kind of think back and say perhaps the response here was disproportionate. So I just wonder what your views were. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think you very, very clearly, crystal clear, sketched the problem. Of course, one solution might be that only very old women and men may need a inspection because of less ego, and I really believe that might be a part of this solution. But as I said this morning, I also believe that perhaps, I believe that there's, in essence, there is an external push necessary to change the system. And such a push might be done in the sense that another type of crisis or the risk, we had quite a few speakers today who have elaborated on the risk, and how they feel this risk from these Russians who are invading Ukraine, and perhaps the threats for our Chinese, Taiwanese friends from China, that we need a new risk to be able to clean up the old risk scale.
Please, can I just respond on a specific thing? At the policy level, I see risk-based and proportionate response as being synonyms, not in conflict with each other. But the task is, as you say, to communicate with that. That's why I added to my presentation two documents which are very, very old, not generated in a social media world. That's one of the challenges. But the only way to do it is to have frank and open conversations with the public and try and change their perceptions about it. Express the things in terms that they can understand, in terms of when you're responding to things. And responding to acts, I mean, we had an example where we had 2 or 3 tower cranes collapse in the construction industry, and there was a pressure group built. So is this being filmed? Is this being filmed?
Are we still filming? Okay.
Sorry, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's something.
So a campaign started to actually get a public register of all the tower cranes on the construction sites. And I was the chief inspector of construction, and I said, you don't need a register of all the tower cranes. You can see all the bloody tower cranes because they are big tower cranes. What does a register do? We should be concentrating our energy in engaging with the construction industry to get them to raise their game. And we did that. We did it centrally rather than dealing with individual companies. We actually got the industry to write a new set of guidance to cover this area, which they normally subcontract to specialist contractors and relying on their competence. That wasn't working, and that's what happened, and it's significantly reduced, the impact of it. But we went along to a meeting with the minister to talk about this proposal for it. And, one of the things in the UK system, in the diagram there, the health and safety legislation, it's actually not decided by ministers, it's decided by the health and safety executive who advise ministers, and they very rarely don't take their advice. The minister said, well, I read the papers and I've decided we've got that set of tower crane regulations. Go up and look down. And so the senior civil servant in the department, the most senior civil servant in the department came and said, sorry about that, Kevin, some you win, some you lose, but what you need to understand is his reputation is at risk, because if he didn't agree this, the next time the tower crane collapsed, he will be held accountable. And I said, but, so we get the regulations, the next time the tower crane collapses, he's going to be held accountable because all he produced was a bloody register. You know, the thinking starts to get perverted. We need to be able to engage and have conversations, and it's a challenge, but it can be done. And I don't think we should underestimate the intelligence of the public if we can communicate with them effectively. There is a tendency sometimes to actually be slightly patronising about the intelligence of the public, and that's the path to hell as far as I'm concerned. By the way, the tower cranes regulations were repealed 3 or 4 years later by the new government when they came in. The only sensible decision they took.
We can edit this out.
I think I probably said enough about this topic in my last talk, except one thing that occurred to me. I started by saying it's a bit of a history lesson, which it is, and it's mostly before social media. And I'm not sure how much social media would be changing this sort of conversation. When we're talking about, well, maybe the public do understand a bit better, or maybe the public do have some wisdom. Possibly. Social media is changing so much in our life. And social media is changing how we do regulatory delivery as well. Because that is where values change. That is where people are influenced. The biggest changes coming through society are being shaped in social media. And one of the reasons that we have the model of enact and enforce is because we didn't have social media back in all these hundreds of years ago. Because enact and enforce, that's meant to change behaviours. Well, nowadays, if you want to change behaviours, you do it through social media. You don't do it through laws. So the role of the public in influencing these decisions may well be changing because of what is now possible with social media, including attitudes to truth, attitudes to science, and the longevity of any particular conclusion by the public. Because one of the other things about social media is they change the way we think about things, and then change it back again, and then change it to something else. Very unpredictable.
Okay. And short comment from the perspective of the regulator. So, yeah, for sure, it's a necessity for us to know the views and the needs from the customers, from the society, because we serve for the society to bring the best value from the regulation. And of course, when it is clear that the biggest threat, for example, from society is financial frauds, yeah, we should react and we should investigate all the mechanisms and put in place most effective measures, not on the national but also international, to tackle this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Yes, please have a question.
Thank you very much, Greg. Also, I'm a big fan of the work that Donald has described in the Risk and Regulation Advisory Committee and the way the Dutch took it forward. I think it's a great shame it's not been brought more into our discussions about regulatory delivery. Thank you, Donald, for doing that today. I think one of the things that's on the diagram that's I don't think you mentioned is the role of regulators as risk actors. I think that's a part of it that we need to contemplate. We sometimes think everyone else is influencing things for a negative reason, but regulators themselves have all sorts of mixed motivations. The concern with this conversation I have is it's a little bit like the image of a drunken cowboy trying to get onto a horse. And he jumps onto the horse with great vigour because he realises he's on the ground, and he throws himself into the saddle with such vigour that he lands the other side back on the ground. He gets up, dusts himself down, and throws himself back onto the saddle, and promptly falls off the other side again. And the danger here is that we talk about over-responsive risk reflex actions, particularly we always say ministers are responsible for that, and we've all got horror stories of how ministers have done crazy things or tried to do crazy things and they've only been stopped by the wisdom of the regulator. But there is another side to that, which is actually we do need to respond to real risks, and the danger sometimes is that we don't have a response at all. I think the solution is proper fact-based risk assessment with then the challenge of communication you described so eloquently. But I wonder if actually that works, and I wonder if when we look at, for example, the Dutch pendulum, despite the wisdom we've heard about, the Dutch have been on a pendulum from deregulation to regulation, and we've seen that in different countries. So, given all this wisdom, why aren't we solving the problem?
Politicians.
No, also, as Graham said, institutional values or institutional, how do I put this neatly, institutional greed for sometimes even, for example, in the Netherlands we had a regulator who was neglected for decades, and then we had this opportunity because we had serious concerns about, say, earthquake, gas-induced earthquake, and this regulator, as an institution, seemed like a hurt individual that thought, this is our time. And so this is also, and I think that's a point you address correctly. In the end, of course, and that's what everybody says here, we need solid risk analysis. And we need policies based on solid risk analysis. But achieving that is, as you very rightly indicate, more difficult than just saying that we want it.
Any other questions? Anyone? Comments? Otherwise, please join me in thanking the panel for their comments. Thank you very much.